Elijah Jackson, a frail black man in a faded jacket, collapses onto the jet bridge in Dallas, his cane clattering as a white flight attendant, Karen Pierce, drags him by the arm, snarling, "Move it, old man, you're holding up my flight." Passengers gasp, but she smirks, oblivious that he's the billionaire owner of Horizon Airlines. Hours later, as the plane lands in Los Angeles, her smug grin fades when security storms aboard, whispering his name. This humiliation ignites a revenge that'll shatter her world. What happens next? Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from today, and if you stand for justice against prejudice, hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales of truth unveiled. Elijah Jackson moved through the crowded terminal of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who'd earned every wrinkle on his face. At 72, his body bore the weight of time, his joints stiff. With arthritis, his thin frame draped in a faded brown jacket that hung loose on his shoulders, his gray hair, once thick and proud, had thinned to a wispy crown, combed back with care. In his right hand, he clutched a cracked leather satchel, its edges worn smooth from decades of use, a relic of a life built from nothing. His left hand gripped a simple wooden cane, its tip tapping faintly against the polished floor as he navigated the chaos. Around him, travelers surged like a river in flood season, their rolling suitcases clattering, their voices a dull roar of impatience and exhaustion. Businessmen in crisp suits barked into phones, families corralled whining kids, and college students hauled overstuffed backpacks, all rushing toward gates with the urgency of a last-minute sprint. Elijah, though, was invisible to them. Just another old black man in economy-class clothes, blending into the blur of 1,000 faces. His sharp brown eyes, framed by deep lines, caught every detail, every sidelong glance, every unconscious dismissal. He'd spent a lifetime watching people, reading them, knowing exactly what they assumed about him before they even opened their mouths. The air smelled of stale coffee and overpriced pretzels, the kind sold at kiosks where harried workers barely looked up from their registers. Overhead, a garbled voice crackled through the intercom, announcing delays and gate changes in a monotone that barely cut through the din. Elijah's gate, B12, loomed ahead, a swarm of passengers already clotting around the check-in desk. He adjusted his grip on the satchel, feeling the familiar ache in his fingers, and stepped into the line. His boarding pass, printed on flimsy paper, fluttered slightly as he pulled it from his pocket, the edges curling from being folded too many times. He'd booked this flight himself, a quiet test of the airline he'd built from the ground up. Decades ago, Horizon Airlines, now a sprawling empire he rarely visited in person. Today, he was no CEO, no billionaire, just a passenger in seat 23B, economy class, a deliberate choice to see how his legacy held up under the weight of its own growth. Ahead of him, a young white couple argued over whose turn it was to carry their toddler, their voices sharp and clipped. Behind him, a middle-aged woman in a bright red scarf muttered about the line moving too slowly, her perfume stinging Elijah's nose with its floral bite. He stayed silent, his breath steady, his posture unhurried. When he finally reached the desk, the flight attendant behind the counter glanced up, her eyes narrowing as she took him in. Karen Pierce was a striking figure, tall and lean, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Her uniform, a navy blazer and skirt, was pressed to perfection, the Horizon Airlines pin on her lapel catching the light. She couldn't have been more than 35, but her face carried the hard edges of someone who'd spent too many years enforcing rules she didn't question. Her skin was pale, almost porcelain, a stark contrast to the crimson lipstick she wore like a warning. She didn't smile, didn't offer the perfunctory greeting he'd seen her give the couple ahead of him. Instead, she snapped her fingers, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Ticket and ID, let's go." Elijah nodded, his movements slow but precise, and slid the boarding pass and his driver's license across the counter. His fingers trembled slightly, a faint shake he couldn't hide anymore, but his grip was firm enough to keep the papers steady. Karen snatched them up, her manicured nails clicking against the plastic surface of her scanner. She barely glanced at his face, her eyes flicking over the documents with the impatience of someone who'd already decided he wasn't worth her time. The scanner beeped, a harsh green light flashing across her screen, and she thrust the papers back at him without a word. "Economy's in the back," she muttered, her southern drawl thick with disdain. "Don't clog up my line." The words landed like a slap, her assumption clear as day. He was poor, insignificant, a nobody in her meticulously ordered world. Elijah's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile, but he said nothing. He tucked the boarding pass into his pocket, adjusted his satchel, and turned toward the jet bridge, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the floor. The line stretched ahead, a bottleneck of passengers funneling into the narrow tunnel that led to the plane. Elijah moved with care, his steps measured to avoid the jostling elbows and swinging bags. A few feet in front of him, a Latina woman struggled with her carry-on, a scuffed black suitcase that refused to fit into the overhead space she'd claimed. Her name was Sophia Morales, though Elijah didn't know that yet. A single mother in her late 30s with tired eyes and a determined set neuron to her jaw. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, strands escaping to frame her flushed face as she wrestled with the bag. Without a word, Elijah stepped forward, his cane braced against the floor as he reached up with his free hand. His fingers, gnarled but steady, gripped the suitcase's handle, guiding it into place with a gentle push. Sophia turned, surprise softening her features, and offered a quiet, "Thank you, sir," her voice warm with gratitude. Elijah nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "No trouble," he said softly, his tone low and gravelly, the kind of voice that carried weight without raising its volume. From a few rows ahead, Karen Pierce watched the exchange, her arms crossed over her chest as she stood near the first-class cabin. She'd been adjusting pillows on the plush seats, her movements brisk and efficient, when she caught sight of Elijah's slow, deliberate act. Her brows furrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. Something about his measured pace, his quiet kindness, grated on her nerves. She shook her head, her lips curling into a faint sneer, and muttered under her breath, "Slow minorities, holding everything up." The words were quiet, meant for no one but herself, but they hung in the air like a stain. She turned back to her task, fluffing a pillow with more force than necessary, dismissing Elijah as nothing more than a nuisance in her tightly controlled domain. Elijah heard her, though. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, but he'd spent a lifetime tuning his ears to the whispers people thought he couldn't catch. He didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't give her the satisfaction of a glance. Instead, he continued down the aisle, his cane tapping faintly against the carpeted floor, his satchel swinging lightly at his side. The plane was a Boeing 737, its interior a mix of worn gray seats and flickering overhead lights, the kind of aircraft that had seen too many flights to count. Passengers shuffled past, their voices a low hum as they claimed their spots, stowing bags and buckling belts. Elijah reached the boarding door, stepping onto the jet bridge with the same unhurried pace he'd carried through the terminal. His mind, though, was anything but slow. Karen's words echoed in his head, a spark igniting a fire he'd banked long ago. She thought she knew him, thought she had him pegged as some broke, irrelevant old man. She had no idea who he was, what he'd built, or what he could do. He boarded silently, his sharp eyes glinting with a plan already taking shape. The jet bridge stretched ahead, a cold metallic tunnel that smelled faintly of jet fuel and rubber. The walls were scuffed from years of baggage carts and hurried feet, the floor slick with a thin sheen of condensation from the Texas humidity clashing with the plane's air conditioning. Elijah's cane clicked against the metal, a steady beat in the chaos of boarding. He could feel the weight of Karen's gaze behind him, though he didn't turn to check. She was watching, judging, assuming, and that was fine by him. Let her think she was in charge. Let her dig her own hole. He'd been underestimated before, countless times, by people just like her, people who saw his skin, his age, his clothes, and decided he was less than nothing. Every one of them had learned the hard way, and Karen Pierce would be no different. As he stepped onto the plane, the hum of the engines vibrating faintly through the floor, Elijah's mind churned with possibilities. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a test, a reckoning, and he was ready to see it through. Elijah Jackson stepped onto the jet bridge, the cold metal floor slick beneath his worn shoes, his cane tapping a faint rhythm that echoed off the scuffed walls. The tunnel stretched ahead, a narrow chute funneling passengers toward the Boeing 737 waiting at gate B12. The air was thick with the tang of jet fuel and the murmur of restless travelers, their voices bouncing off the curved ceiling like a swarm of buzzing insects. Elijah's faded brown jacket brushed against the wall as he moved, his cracked leather satchel swinging lightly at his side. He'd made it halfway down the bridge, his steps slow but steady, when the sole of his shoe caught a wet patch, a spill from some careless traveler's coffee cup. His cane slipped, skidding out from under him with a sharp clatter, and his frail body pitched forward. His knees buckled, his free hand flailing for balance, but before he could hit the ground, a rough grip clamped onto his arm, yanking him upright with a force that made his joints scream. Karen Pierce loomed over him, her blonde bun gleaming under the harsh lights, her navy uniform crisp against the dull gray of the jet bridge, her pale face twisted into a scowl, her crimson lips curling as she tightened her hold on his arm. "Move it, old man. You're holding up my flight," she snapped, her southern drawl slicing through the air like a blade. Without waiting for a response, she dragged him forward, her polished shoes clicking against the floor as she hauled him 20 feet down the tunnel. Elijah's feet scrambled to keep up, his cane dangling uselessly from his left hand, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His satchel slipped from his shoulder, hitting the ground with a dull thud, and papers spilled out, fluttering across the wet metal like fallen leaves. Among them was an old Polaroid, yellowed at the edges, showing a younger Elijah standing proud, beside two men in suits, the Horizon Airlines logo faint but visible in the background. Karen didn't notice, didn't care. She kicked the photo aside with the toe of her shoe, her sneer deepening as she muttered, "Clumsy fool, making a mess. For me to clean up." Passengers froze mid-step, their eyes wide as they watched the scene unfold. A teenage girl in a hoodie clutched her phone, her jaw dropping as she whispered to her mother, "Did you see that?" A burly man in a Cowboys jersey shook his head, his fists clenching at his sides, while an elderly couple near the boarding door exchanged a look of quiet outrage. Sofia Morales, the Latina mother Elijah had helped in the terminal, stood just ahead, her scuffed black suitcase still in hand. Her tired eyes narrowed, her lips parting in disbelief as Karen dragged Elijah past her. "Hey, stop that," Sofia called, stepping forward, her voice trembling with anger. "He's not hurting anyone, let him go." Karen didn't even glance her way. She released Elijah's arm with a shove, sending him stumbling into the wall, his shoulder slamming against the cold metal with a dull thump. "Mind your business, lady," Karen barked, her tone dripping with contempt as she dusted off her hands like she'd touched something filthy. "I've got a plane to run and he's slowing us down." Elijah caught himself, his palm pressing against the wall for support, his chest heaving as he fought to steady his breathing. His cane lay a few feet away, its wooden surface scratched from the fall, and he bent slowly to retrieve it, his fingers trembling as they closed around the handle. Pain radiated from his arm where Karen's grip had left red marks on his dark skin, a stark contrast against the faded fabric of his sleeve. He straightened, his sharp brown eyes locking onto Karen for a fleeting moment. But he didn't speak. His face was a mask of calm, the deep lines around his mouth and eyes betraying nothing of the humiliation burning in his gut. The spilled papers lay scattered behind him, the Polaroid half hidden beneath a crumpled boarding pass, but he didn't move to pick them up. Not yet. He adjusted his jacket, his movements deliberate, and took a step toward the plane, his cane tapping once, more against the floor. The crowd stirred, their murmurs growing into a low rumble of discontent. The teenage girl pulled out her phone again, her fingers hovering over the screen as if debating whether to record. The burly man muttered something under his breath, his voice too low to catch, but his glare followed Karen like a predator tracking prey. Sofia clenched her fists, her dark ponytail swaying as she turned to the elderly couple beside her. "She can't just do that, can she?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. The old woman, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, shook her head slowly. "No, she can't," she replied, her tone firm. "That's no way to treat anyone, especially not an old man who's done nothing wrong." Her husband nodded, his weathered hands tightening around his wife's armrest. "Someone ought to report her," he added, his voice gruff with indignation. Karen ignored them all, her posture rigid as she strode toward the boarding door, her head held high like a queen dismissing peasants. She assumed her authority was absolute, that no one would dare challenge her on her own turf. Her smirk lingered, a faint curve of triumph as she glanced back at Elijah, now limping toward the plane's entrance. She saw weakness, frailty, a black man too old and too poor to matter in her world. What did he have to fight back with? A cane and a ratty jacket? She almost laughed at the thought, her confidence unshaken as she stepped onto the aircraft, her polished shoes clicking against the threshold. The passengers filed in behind her, their whispers trailing like smoke, but she didn't hear them. She was too busy reveling in her control, oblivious to the storm she'd just unleashed. Elijah reached the spilled papers, his knees creaking as he bent to gather them. His fingers brushed the Polaroid, the image of his younger self staring back at him, a reminder of the empire he'd built from scratch. He tucked it into his satchel, his movement slow but steady, and straightened once more. The pain in his arm throbbed, a dull ache that pulsed with every heartbeat, but his mind was clear, sharp as a razor. Karen thought she'd won, thought she'd put him in his place. She had no idea who he was, no clue that the frail old man she'd just dragged through the jet bridge was the billionaire who owned Horizon Airlines, the very company that signed her paychecks. This wasn't just humiliation anymore. It was fuel, a spark igniting a fire that had been smoldering for years. He'd faced worse than her in his 72 years, fought bigger battles, toppled stronger foes. Karen Pierce was just the latest, in a long line of fools who'd underestimated him, and she'd pay for it in ways she couldn't imagine. As he stepped onto the plane, the hum of the engines vibrated through the floor, a low growl that matched the resolve hardening in his chest. The aisle stretched ahead, rows of gray seats already filling with passengers, their eyes flickering toward him with a mix of pity and curiosity. He didn't need their sympathy. He needed their witness. Karen had crossed a line, and he'd make sure she felt the weight of it. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. He'd learned patience the hard way, honed it over decades of clawing his way up from nothing. This flight was just the beginning, a single move in a game she didn't even know she was playing. He limped toward his seat, 23B, his cane tapping a steady beat, his satchel clutched tight. The storm was coming, and Karen Pierce was standing right in its path. Hey folks, what do you think about this? Comment with a 1 if you're furious at Karen's arrogance and think she deserves what's coming, or a 2 if you're rooting for Elijah to turn the tables. Should she have seen the signs, or is she too blind to care? Drop your thoughts below, smash that like button if you're hooked on this fight for justice, and hit subscribe to catch every twist as Elijah's story unfolds. Could you stand by while someone's humiliated like that? Or would you step in like Sophia? Now here's the big question. Will Karen's next move dig her hole deeper, or does Elijah have a trick up his sleeve she'll never see coming? Elijah Jackson eased himself into seat 23B, the worn gray fabric of the Boeing 737's economy section creaking faintly under his slight weight. The plane's interior buzzed with the restless energy of boarding. Passengers, jostling for overhead space, their voices a chaotic hum over the low rumble of the engines warming up outside. His faded brown jacket bunched around his shoulders as he settled in, his cracked leather satchel resting on his lap like a shield. His right arm throbbed where Karen Pierce had gripped him on the jet bridge, the red marks still vivid against his dark skin. But he kept his face composed, his sharp brown eyes scanning the cabin with quiet precision. His wooden cane leaned against the armrest, its scratched surface catching the dim light from the overhead panels. The seat beside him was empty for now, but across the aisle, a white man in his 40s, Tom Hargrove, stowed a sleek briefcase, his crisp button-down shirt a stark contrast to Elijah's threadbare clothes. Tom glanced over, offering a quick nod, but Elijah's attention gong-lu. The cabin smelled faintly of recycled air and cheap cologne, the kind that clung to the seats after too many flights. The overhead vents hissed softly, blowing cool air that did little to ease the stuffiness as passengers settled in. Elijah adjusted his satchel, his gnarled fingers brushing the cracked leather, and leaned back, his body stiff from the jet bridge ordeal. His stomach growled faintly, a reminder that he hadn't eaten since breakfast, a simple bowl of oatmeal at his modest Dallas apartment. He'd pre-ordered a meal for this flight, a small indulgence he'd allowed himself, expecting a tray of chicken and rice to tide him over until Los Angeles. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the cabin crew began their rounds, the clatter of the meal cart echoing down the aisle like a promise. Karen Pierce emerged from the galley, her navy uniform pristine, her blonde bun as tight as her expression. She pushed the cart with brisk efficiency, her polished shoes clicking against the carpeted floor. Her crimson lips set in a thin line. She stopped at each row, handing out trays with a practiced indifference. Her voice clipped as she asked, "Chicken or pasta?" Her sharp blue eyes darted over the passengers, assessing them in an instant, deciding who deserved her attention and who didn't. When she reached Elijah's row, she paused, her gaze settling on him with a flicker of recognition. The frail black man she'd dragged down the jet bridge stared back, his posture calm, his hands folded over his satchel. "I ordered a meal," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of a man who'd learned to speak softly and still be heard. "Chicken, I think." Karen's lips twitched into a smirk, a cruel little curve that didn't reach her eyes. She flipped open her clipboard, her manicured nails tapping against the plastic as she scanned the list. "No record of it," she said, her southern drawl thick with dismissal. "You should have checked that before boarding. No meal for you." She snapped the clipboard shut, her tone final, as if his hunger was his own fault, a problem beneath her notice. Elijah's brows furrowed slightly, his fingers tightening around the satchel. "I paid for it online," he insisted, keeping his voice even. "It's in the system. Just look again." Her smirk widened, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes as she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a patronizing whisper. "System says no, old man. Guess you're out of luck." Tom Hargrove, seated across the aisle, looked up from his laptop, his square jaw tightening as he caught the exchange. He'd already unwrapped his tray, a steaming plate of pasta he hadn't touched yet, and his hazel eyes narrowed at Karen's tone. "Hey, I've got an extra," he said, sliding the tray toward Elijah. "He can have mine. No big deal." His voice was casual, but there was an edge to it, a challenge Karen didn't miss. She straightened, her posture stiffening as she snatched the tray from Tom's hands before Elijah could reach for it. "Rules are rules," she snapped, her voice rising just enough to draw eyes from nearby seats. "He doesn't get specials, treatment, just because you feel sorry for him." She shoved the tray back onto the cart, her movements sharp, her gaze flicking to Elijah with a mix of disdain and triumph. "Next time, plan better." Elijah sat still, his stomach twisting with a hunger that went beyond food. The red marks on his arm pulsed faintly, a reminder of her earlier assault. And now this. Another jab at his dignity, another assumption that his place was beneath her. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. His sharp brown eyes followed her as she moved to the next row, her cart rattling with every step. Tom shook his head, muttering under his breath. Unbelievable. The woman beside him, a young redhead with freckles dotting her nose, leaned over, her voice a hushed whisper. "She's got no right treating him like that. What's her problem?" Tom shrugged, his fingers tapping the armrest. "Some people just like kicking down when they can." The plane climbed higher, the engines roaring as it cut through the Texas sky, the cabin lights dimming slightly as the flight settled into its rhythm. Elijah stared out the small, scratched window, the clouds stretching endless and white below, a vastness that mirrored the resolve hardening in his chest. His stomach growled again, louder this time, a hollow ache that gnawed at him. But he ignored it. He'd gone hungry before, back when he was a kid in a cramped Houston tenement, back when every meal was a fight. This was nothing new, just another test, another slight to add to the tally. Karen thought she'd won this round, thought she'd put him in his place again. She didn't know the half of it. He'd built Horizon Airlines from a single plane and a dream, turned it into a giant that spanned continents. And he hadn't done it by letting people like her grind him down. The cart rattled past, Karen's voice fading as she served the rows ahead, her smugness palpable even from a distance. Passengers unwrapped their meals, the scent of overcooked chicken and soggy vegetables filling the air, a cruel tease for the man left empty-handed. Elijah's fingers brushed the satchel, tracing the worn leather, his mind turning over the pieces of a plan he'd been shaping since the jet bridge. She thought he was powerless, a nobody she could dismiss with a smirk and a shrug. She was, wrong dead wrong, and the realization was a quiet fire in his gut, stoking itself hotter with every passing minute. He'd let her dig her hole a little deeper, let her think she was untouchable. When the time came, she'd see just how high the stakes could climb. Around him, the cabin settled into a restless quiet, the clink of plastic utensils, and the rustle of wrappers punctuating the hum of the engines. Tom glanced over again, his brow creased with something like guilt, but he didn't speak. The redhead beside him whispered to her friend, her words too soft to catch, though her eyes kept darting, to Elijah with a mix of pity and anger. Up ahead, Karen laughed at something a first-class passenger said, her tone warm and bright, a stark contrast to the cold edge she'd turned on Elijah. The difference wasn't lost on him, wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. She played her role like a queen on a throne, doling out favor and scorn as she saw fit, blind to the storm brewing in the man she'd dismissed. Elijah leaned back, his cane resting against his knee, his hunger a dull ache he could push aside. This was just the beginning, and he was ready for the fight. The Boeing 737 hummed through the sky, its engines a steady growl as it sliced through wispy clouds 30,000 feet above the Texas plains. Inside, the cabin had settled into the uneasy rhythm of a long flight, the air thick, with the mingled scents of reheated meals and restless bodies. Elijah Jackson sat in seat 23B, his frail frame pressed against the worn gray cushion, his faded brown jacket bunched around his thin shoulders. His cracked leather satchel rested on his lap, a quiet anchor amid the chaos of the past hour. His right arm still ached from Karen Pierce's grip on the jet bridge, the red marks fading into a dull bruise, and his stomach gnawed at him, empty after her smug denial of his pre-ordered meal. His sharp brown eyes, framed by deep lines, stared out the scratched window, watching the endless white expanse below. But his mind was elsewhere, turning over every slight, every jab. Building a fire he kept carefully banked. Across the aisle, Tom Hargrove tapped away at his laptop, his crisp white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his hazel eyes occasionally flicking toward Elijah with a mix of curiosity and unease. Beside him, the redhead with freckles chewed on a granola bar, her gaze darting between her snack and the old man left hungry. Up ahead, Sofia Morales, the Latina mother Elijah had helped in the terminal, shifted in her seat, her dark ponytail swaying as she adjusted her sleeping toddler on her lap. The cabin lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the rows of passengers, some dozing, others lost in their screens. The meal cart had long since rattled past, leaving Elijah with nothing but the bitter taste of Karen's dismissal lingering in his throat. He'd faced worse, he reminded himself, far worse. But that didn't dull the sting of her arrogance, the way she'd smirked as she snatched Tom's offered tray from his reach. Sophia glanced back at him, her tired eyes softening with something like guilt. She reached into her scuffed black carry-on, pulling out a small granola bar wrapped in crinkly plastic, its edges worn from being jostled in her bag. She leaned across the aisle, her voice a hushed whisper as she held it out. "She's awful," she said, nodding toward the front where Karen had disappeared into the galley. "Take this, please. You shouldn't go hungry because of her." Elijah turned his head slowly, his sharp gaze meeting hers, and a faint smile tugged at his lips, crinkling the lines around his eyes. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, his gravelly voice low but warm as he took the bar, his gnarled fingers brushing hers. He unwrapped it carefully, the sound of crinkling plastic sharp in the quiet cabin, and took a small bite. The oats and honey a fleeting comfort against the ache in his gut. The gesture wasn't lost on Tom. He closed his laptop with a soft click, leaning toward Elijah, his voice low but firm. "That wasn't right what she did. You paid for a meal, same as us." The redhead nodded, swallowing her bite before adding, "She's got no excuse treating you like that." Elijah chewed slowly, his jaw working the granola as he considered their words. He swallowed, then met Tom's gaze, his tone steady. I told her I paid for it. She didn't believe me. Sophia's brow furrowed, her grip tightening on her toddler's blanket. That's ridiculous, she said, her voice rising just enough to draw a few nearby heads. They've got records for everything these days. She could have checked if she wanted to. Elijah nodded, setting the half-eaten bar on his satchel. She could have, he agreed, his eyes glinting with a quiet resolve. Let's see. If she will. He raised his voice slightly, just enough to carry up the aisle. Miss Pierce, he called, his tone polite but firm, cutting through the cabin's hum. Heads turned, passengers stirring from their stupor as Karen emerged from the galley, her navy blazer pristine, her blonde bun catching the light. She strode toward him, her polished shoes clicking with every step, her crimson lips pressed into a thin line of irritation. What now? She snapped, stopping at his row, her hands planted on her hips. I told you, no meal. What's the problem? Elijah held her gaze, his sharp brown eyes unblinking. Check again, he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. I paid for that meal online 2 days ago. It's in your system. Karen's smirk returned, a cruel twist that made her pale face sharper. I already checked, old man. Nothing's there. You're wasting my time. Tom leaned forward, his voice cutting in. If he says he paid, you should look. It's not hard. Sophia nodded, her toddler stirring as she added, Yeah, why's it such a big deal to double-check? The redhead chimed in, her freckles stark against her flushed cheeks. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Karen's eyes narrowed, her smirk faltering as the pressure built. Passengers murmured, their whispers a growing tide of discontent. She glanced around, her posture stiffening, then huffed out a breath. Fine, she muttered, pulling her clipboard from the cart with a sharp yank. She flipped through the pages, her nails tapping an impatient rhythm, then paused, her brow creasing faintly. Well, look at that, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm as she tossed a cold tray onto Elijah's lap. Guess it's there, after all. Happy now? The tray landed with a thud, the chicken congealed, the rice a clumpy mess. But Elijah didn't flinch. He nodded, his fingers brushing the plastic cover. Thank you, he said simply, his voice even, as if he'd won a small war. Karen rolled her eyes, turning to stalk back up the aisle, her cart rattling as she went. Elijah peeled back the foil, the faint steam rising from the cold food, a hollow victory. He took a bite, the chicken tough and flavorless, but it was something. A crack in her armor he'd forced open. Tom gave him a thumbs up, Sophia smiled faintly, and the redhead whispered, Good for you. For a moment, Elijah let himself believe he'd turned the tide, that this small stand had shifted the balance. His stomach settled, the hunger easing as he ate, his sharp mind savoring the taste of her reluctant surrender. She'd backed down, and that felt like a win, a fleeting glimmer of justice in the cramped confines of economy class. But the plane had other plans. Halfway through his meal, the cart rattled back down the aisle, Karen at the helm, her smirk replaced by a glint of something darker. She carried a tray of coffee cups, her movements brisk as she handed them out to passengers ahead. When she reached Elijah's row, she paused, her sharp blue eyes locking onto him. Coffee, sir? She asked, her tone sickly sweet, a stark shift from her earlier venom. Elijah nodded, setting his tray aside. Black, please, he said, his voice steady. She poured from a steaming pot, the rich aroma filling the air as she handed him the cup, her fingers brushing his with a deliberate slowness. Careful now, she said, her lips curling faintly. Wouldn't want you to spill. He took a sip, the heat soothing against his throat, and settled back, the cup warm in his hands. But then it hit, a scalding jolt as Karen tripped, her elbow knocking the cup from his grip. The coffee splashed across his lap, searing through his thin pants, blistering the skin on his thighs and forearm as he jolted upright with a sharp hiss. The tray clattered to the floor, the half-eaten meal scattering across his shoes. Oops, clumsy me, Karen said, her voice a mocking lilt as she straightened, her smirk back in full force. Passengers gasped, Tom cursing under his breath as he grabbed napkins, Sophia clutching her toddler tighter as she stared in horror. The redhead's jaw dropped, her granola bar falling to her lap. Elijah's hand shook as he pressed the napkins. To his burns, the pain a white-hot lance through his nerves. Red welts rose on his dark skin, the coffee soaking his jacket in dark, splotchy stains. Karen stepped back, her hands raised in mock innocence. "Should have held it tighter," she said, her tone dripping with glee as she turned away, leaving him to suffer. The cabin erupted in whispers, outrage simmering as passengers craned their necks to see. Elijah gritted his teeth, his sharp eyes burning with a fury he kept leashed. This wasn't an accident. She'd retaliated, hit him harder, meaner, turning his small victory into ash. His burns throbbed, his pride stung, but his resolve hardened into something unbreakable. She thought she'd won this round, thought she'd crushed him. She was wrong, and he'd make her pay. The Boeing 737 shuddered through the sky, its metal frame groaning as it hit a pocket of rough air 35,000 feet above the sprawling deserts of New Mexico. Inside, the cabin jolted, the overhead lights flickering as passengers gripped their armrests, their murmurs rising into a nervous buzz. Elijah Jackson sat in seat 23B, his frail body tense against the worn gray cushion, his faded brown jacket still damp with coffee stains from Karen Pierce's vicious accident. His cracked leather satchel rested on the floor, now tucked beneath the seat, its contents a quiet testament to a life she'd never understand. His right arm throbbed, the red marks from her jet bridge assault now joined by angry welts on his thighs and forearm, the burns blistering beneath. His soaked pants, his wooden cane, scratched and battered, leaned against his knee, a lifeline he couldn't afford to lose. His sharp brown eyes, etched with pain but alight with resolve, stared straight ahead, his mind a steel trap snapping shut around every move Karen had made. The plane lurched again, a sharp drop that sent trays clattering and a child's cry piercing the air. Elijah's cane slid from its perch, skittering across the carpeted floor with a dull thud as the turbulence rocked the cabin. He reached for it, his gnarled fingers stretching. But the plane bucked once more, throwing him off balance. His left hand shot out, gripping the armrest of the seat in front of him, a young woman's startled yelp cutting through the noise as he steadied himself. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, the burns on his legs flaring with every movement, but he held on, his frail frame trembling under the strain. Across the aisle, Tom Hargrove slammed his laptop shut, his hazel eyes wide as he braced himself, while Sophia Morales clutched her toddler tighter, her dark ponytail whipping as she whispered soothing words. The redhead beside Tom clutched her armrest, her freckles stark against her pale, panicked face. Karen Pierce stormed down the aisle, her navy blazer still pristine despite the chaos, her blonde bun unmoved by the plane's violent shakes. Her polished shoes clicked with purpose, her sharp blue eyes scanning the cabin like a hawk hunting prey. She spotted Elijah, his hand still gripping the seat ahead, his cane lying a few feet away near the window. Her lips curled into a sneer, her crimson lipstick a slash of color against her pale skin as she closed the distance. "Sit down, you're a hazard," she barked, her southern drawl thick with venom. Before Elijah could respond, she planted her hands on his shoulders, shoving him back into his seat with a force that slammed his head against the window. The glass rattled, a sharp crack of sound as his temple struck the frame, a thin trickle of blood seeping from a fresh cut above his eyebrow. Elijah grunted, his vision blurring for a split second as pain exploded through his skull. His hands flailed, grasping for the armrests as the burns on his legs screamed in protest. Karen loomed over him, her posture rigid, her voice rising above the turbulence. "You're disrupting safety, old man. Stay put, or I'll have you restrained." Her words were a weapon, sharp and deliberate, painting him as a threat in a cabin already on edge. Passengers turned, their eyes wide with shock, some clutching their seats tighter as the plane jolted again. Tom's jaw clenched, his fists balling, as he muttered, "She's out of control." Sophia's toddler whimpered, her own voice trembling as she said, "He wasn't doing anything wrong." The redhead gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the blood on Elijah's face. But one passenger didn't stay silent. Jamal Carter, a black man in his 30s seated 2 rows ahead, pulled out his phone, its sleek black case glinting as he angled it toward the scene. His short dreads framed a face tight with outrage. His brown eyes narrowed as he hit record, capturing Karen's shove, Elijah's pained wince, the blood trickling down his temple. "This is going viral," he said, his voice low but firm, loud enough for Karen to hear. She spun toward him, her sneer twisting into a snarl as she caught sight of the phone. "No filming allowed," she snapped, lunging forward to snatch it from his hands. Jamal jerked back, holding it out of reach, but Karen was relentless. She grabbed his wrist, twisting hard until he yelped, the phone slipping from his grip and clattering to the floor. She scooped it up, her movements swift and triumphant, and shoved it into her blazer pocket. "That's confiscated," she said, her tone dripping with authority as she straightened, her sharp eyes daring anyone to challenge her. Jamal rubbed his wrist, his face a mask of fury, but he didn't speak. Not yet. The plane steadied, the turbulence easing as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and measured. "Folks, we've hit some rough air, but we're through it now. Please remain seated." The cabin exhaled, a collective release of tension, but Elijah's world was still spinning. Blood dripped onto his collar, warm and sticky, his head pounding, as he pressed a trembling hand to the cut. His burns throbbed, his body a map of pain, but his mind was razor-sharp, cutting through the haze. Karen stepped back, her smirk returning as she dusted off her hands, her gaze sweeping the cabin with a quiet glee. She'd turned his stumble into a spectacle, framed him as a danger, and silenced the one man brave enough to document it. "Passengers," whispered, their voices a low rumble of disbelief and anger. Tom shook his head, his voice a growl. "She's a bully with a badge." Sophia's eyes glistened, her toddler now asleep against her chest as she muttered, "Someone's got to stop her." The redhead stared at Elijah, her voice barely audible. That was too far. But Karen didn't care. She strode back up the aisle, Jamal's phone a trophy in her pocket, her confidence unshaken. She thought she'd won, thought she'd crushed any resistance. Elijah wiped the blood from his brow, his fingers smearing red across his dark skin, as he steadied his breathing. His cane lay near the window, out of reach, but he didn't move for it yet. Pain radiated from his temple, a pulsing ache that matched the fury building in his chest. She'd hit him, publicly, viciously, and turned it into a show of power. But he wasn't broken, not even close. His sharp eyes flicked to Jamal, catching the younger man's gaze. A silent understanding passed between them, a spark of alliance in the chaos. Elijah's hand slipped into his jacket pocket, brushing the edge of a burner phone he'd kept hidden, its screen dark but ready. He'd get that footage back one way or another. Karen thought she'd silenced him, thought she'd buried the evidence. She was wrong. The cabin settled, the engines humming as the flight stretched on, but the air was thick with unspoken rage. Elijah sat still, his blood-streaked face a quiet testament to her cruelty, his mind racing with plans she couldn't fathom. He'd built Horizon Airlines from nothing, fought through worse storms than this, and he'd be damned if he let her break him now. She'd escalated, turned her racism into violence, and he'd make sure it cost her. His burns, his bruises, his blood, they were fuel, and he was ready to burn her world down. Hey folks, what's your take on this madness? Comment with a 1 if you think Karen's gone too far and deserves to crash hard, or a 2 if you're stunned Elijah's still fighting after that brutal hit. Was Jamal right to record, or should he have stayed out of it? Drop your thoughts below, smash that like button if you're raging at this injustice, and hit subscribe to see how Elijah turns the tables. Can you believe Karen's nerve stealing that phone like she's untouchable? Now here's the kicker. Will Elijah's next move catch her off guard, or has she already stacked the deck against him? The Boeing 737 cruised smoothly now, the turbulence a fading memory as it sliced through the clear night sky somewhere over Arizona, the stars a faint glimmer beyond the scratched windows. Inside, the cabin hummed with a restless quiet, the overhead lights casting a pale glow over rows of passengers sunk into their seats. Elijah Jackson sat in 23B, his frail frame rigid against the worn gray cushion, his faded brown jacket stiff with dried coffee stains. Blood crusted along his temple, a thin line from where Karen Pierce had slammed his head against the window. and the burns on his thighs and forearm pulsed beneath his soaked pants, red welts rising under the fabric. His cracked leather satchel lay tucked beneath the seat, his wooden cane retrieved and propped against his knee, its scratched surface a silent witness to the chaos. His sharp brown eyes, clouded with pain but burning with purpose, stared at the seat back ahead, his mind churning through the violence he'd endured and the retaliation he'd unleash. Across the aisle, Tom Hargrove sat with his laptop closed, his crisp white shirt wrinkled now, his hazel eyes darting toward Elijah with a mix of anger and helplessness. Sophia Morales cradled her sleeping toddler 2 rows up, her dark ponytail still, her tired face etched with worry as she glanced back at the old man. The redhead beside Tom fidgeted with her empty granola wrapper, her freckles stark against her pale skin as she whispered to herself, replaying Karen's shove in her mind. The air smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic, a faint whiff from the napkins Elijah had used to dab his burns and blood. The cabin's hum was punctuated by the occasional rustle of a page or the soft snore of a dozing passenger, but beneath it, a tension simmered, a storm waiting to break. Jamal Carter, 2 rows ahead, rubbed his wrist where Karen had twisted it, his short dreads framing a face tight with frustration. His phone, his proof of her brutality, was gone, confiscated by her smug hands and tucked into her blazer pocket, like a trophy. He turned in his seat, catching Elijah's gaze, his brown eyes flashing with a fire that mirrored the old man's. "That was bullshit," he said, his voice low but fierce, cutting through the cabin's quiet. "She can't get away with this. I'll get that video to the news, I swear." Elijah nodded, his lips twitching into a faint, pained smile. "Appreciate it," he replied, his gravelly voice steady despite the ache in his skull. "We'll make sure it's seen." Jamal pulled out a crumpled napkin and a pen, scribbling his number with quick, angry strokes. He passed it back, Sophia handing it along like a relay, her fingers trembling as she met Elijah's eyes. Elijah took the napkin, his gnarled fingers, folding it into his jacket pocket beside the burner phone he'd kept hidden. A spark of hope flickered in his chest, a thin thread of trust in this stranger who'd risked something to fight back. Jamal leaned back, his jaw set, his mind already racing with contacts, news outlets he'd call the moment they landed. Elijah let himself breathe, the pain in his body easing just enough to imagine a crack in Karen's armor. She'd stolen the phone, but she couldn't erase the truth, not if he and Jamal moved fast. His sharp eyes glinted, a plan forming as he pictured her smug face crumbling when that footage hit the airwaves. But Karen Pierce wasn't done. She emerged from the galley, her navy uniform pristine, her blonde bun gleaming under the lights, as she moved with a predator's grace. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the cabin, landing on Jamal and Elijah with a flicker of recognition. She'd overheard their exchange, caught the edge of their whispered alliance through the cabin's hum. Her crimson lips curled faintly, a calculating glint in her gaze as she turned toward the first-class section, her polished shoes clicking softly. There, a white coworker, Mike Tanner, lounged near the curtain, his broad shoulders filling out, his uniform, his buzzed blonde hair catching the light. He was younger, maybe 28, with a cocky grin and a lazy slump that screamed entitlement. Karen sidled up to him, her voice dropping to a hushed, honeyed tone that didn't carry, past the plush seats. "Mike," she said, leaning close, her hand brushing his arm. "Need a favor. That guy in economy, the one filming me, he's trouble. I've got his phone, but I need it gone." Mike's grin widened, his green eyes flicking toward the back of the plane. "What's in it for me?" he asked, his voice a low drawl. Karen smirked, pulling a first-class voucher from her pocket, its gold trim glinting as she dangled it between her fingers. "Next flight? Front row? Free drinks? Just make it disappear." Mike snatched the voucher, tucking it into his blazer with a chuckle. "Deal," he said, straightening up. "Where's the phone?" She slipped it from her pocket, passing it to him with a quick, discreet handoff, her eyes darting to ensure no one saw. Mike sauntered down the aisle, his stride casual but purposeful, the phone hidden in his fist. He passed Elijah's row, his grin sharpening as he caught the old man's gaze. "Shouldn't have caused trouble," he muttered. loud enough for Elijah to hear, his tone dripping with mockery. He kept walking, disappearing into the galley at the rear, where the clatter of trays masked the faint crunch of plastic as he smashed the phone against the counter. He tossed the pieces into a trash chute, wiping his hands on his pants as he returned to first class, his smirk unshaken. Karen watched from the curtain, her arms crossed, her satisfaction a quiet glow on her pale face. She'd buried the evidence, snuffed out their little rebellion, and she savored every second of it. Jamal felt it first, a sinking dread as he turned to check on Elijah, his eyes searching for a sign of their plan. "She's up to something," he whispered, his voice tight. Elijah nodded, his sharp gaze catching Mike's retreat, the smugness in his step a dead giveaway. He slipped his hand into his pocket, brushing the napkin with Jamal's number, but the hope he'd felt curdled into ash. "It's gone," he said, his gravelly voice low, barely audible over the engines. Jamal's face fell, his fists clenching, as he realized the truth. "That bastard," he muttered, his eyes darting to Mike, then Karen, who stood at the curtain, her smirk a silent taunt. "She got to him." Elijah's gut twisted, a sharp pang that had nothing to do with his burns or bruises. Another ally lost, another thread snapped by the pull of racism and greed. Mike's betrayal stung, a fresh wound atop the others, but it wasn't new. He'd seen it before, countless times, people turning their backs for a bribe, a favor, a chance to stay in the good graces of someone like Karen. His sharp eyes darkened, his mind racing as he recalculated. The footage was gone, their proof destroyed, and Karen stood taller for it, her confidence a wall he'd have to climb, but he wasn't out. His fingers brushed the burner phone again, its weight a quiet promise. He'd sent a text earlier, a single word to a contact who'd never failed him. Watch. They'd lost this round, but the game wasn't over. The cabin stretched on, the hum of the engines a steady drone as passengers settled back into their routines. Tom glanced over, his brow creased, sensing the shift but not understanding it. Sophia rocked her toddler, her eyes flickering with unease, while the redhead whispered to herself, "Something's wrong." Karen returned to her duties, her stride light, her victory a secret she carried like a crown. She thought she'd crushed them, thought she'd silenced their fight. She was wrong, and Elijah knew it. His bloodied temple, his blistered skin, his stolen hope, they were fuel, and he'd burn her empire down with it. He sat still, his cane steady against his knee, his sharp mind plotting a move she'd never see coming. The Boeing 737 droned through the night, its engines a relentless hum as it cut across the starry sky, now somewhere over the dusty expanse of Nevada. Inside, the cabin had settled into a fragile calm, the overhead lights dimmed to a faint flicker, casting long shadows across the rows of passengers. Elijah Jackson sat hunched in seat 23B, his frail frame a silhouette against the scratched window, his faded brown jacket stiff with dried coffee and blood. His cracked leather satchel remained tucked beneath the seat, a silent guardian of secrets Karen Pierce could never guess. His right arm bore the fading red marks of her jet bridge assault. His thighs and forearm blistered from the scalding coffee, and a crusted line of blood traced his temple where she'd slammed his head against the glass. His wooden cane rested against his knee, its scratched surface glinting faintly, a lifeline amid the storm. His sharp brown eyes, dulled by pain but fierce with resolve, stared into the darkness outside, his mind a battlefield of strategy and survival. Across the aisle, Tom Hargrove dozed fitfully, his crisp white shirt rumpled, his laptop slid into the seat pocket. Sophia Morales rocked her toddler 2 rows ahead, the child's soft snores a quiet rhythm against the engines, her dark ponytail, still as she kept one eye on Elijah. The redhead beside Tom twisted her empty granola wrapper, her freckles stark against her pale, restless face. The air carried the faint tang of antiseptic and sweat, a stale reminder of the flight's mounting tension. Jamal Carter sat rigid 2 rows up, his short dreads framing a face etched with fury, his wrist still sore from Karen's twist, his phone now a pile of shattered plastic thanks to her bribe with Mike. The cabin's quiet was a thin veneer, stretched, tight over a simmering rage that pulsed through the passengers who'd witnessed her cruelty. Karen Pierce moved with a predator's confidence, her navy blazer pristine, her blonde bun a beacon under the dim lights as she glided toward the galley. Her sharp blue eyes glinted with a cold satisfaction, her crimson lips set in a faint, triumphant curve. She'd crushed Jamal's footage, silenced their little rebellion, and now she saw a chance to bury Elijah deeper. She'd felt the shift in the cabin, the whispers, the glares, and she wasn't about to let it fester. She needed control, absolute and final, and she knew just how to tighten the noose. She slipped into the galley, her polished shoes silent, against the rubber floor, and leaned toward the intercom, her fingers brushing the button as she summoned the captain. Her voice was low, a calculated whisper as she spoke into the headset. "Captain Reynolds, we've got a problem in economy. Passenger in 23B threatened me during turbulence. He's unstable, could be a risk." Minutes later, the cockpit door clicked open, and Captain Reynolds emerged, a towering figure in his 50s with a gruff demeanor and a salt-and-pepper beard framing a stern jaw. His pilot's uniform was crisp, the gold bars on his shoulders catching the light as he strode down the aisle, his boots thudding against the carpet. His pale face was set in a frown, his gray eyes scanning the cabin with the authority of a man who'd flown through worse storms than this. Passengers stirred, their heads turning as he approached Elijah's row, Karen trailing behind him like a shadow, her smirk hidden, but her satisfaction palpable. Reynolds stopped beside Elijah, his broad frame blocking the aisle, his voice a low growl that cut through the hum. "You're on thin ice, sir. I've got a report you threatened a crew member. That's a federal offense on my plane." Elijah looked up slowly, his sharp brown eyes meeting Reynolds' gaze, his blood-crusted temple a stark accusation against Karen's lie. Pain throbbed through his skull and burns, but his voice was steady, gravelly with age but unshaken. "I didn't threaten anyone," he said, his tone calm, deliberate. "She shoved me during turbulence, that's all." Reynolds' frown deepened, his eyes flicking to Karen, who stepped forward, her posture rigid with feigned indignation. "He grabbed a seat and disrupted safety," she said, her southern drawl thick with venom. "When I told him to sit, he said he'd make me regret it. I felt threatened, Captain." Her words were a blade, sharp and rehearsed, twisting the truth into a noose around Elijah's neck. Passengers murmured, their voices a low ripple of disbelief. Tom jolted awake, his hazel eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. "That's not what happened," he said, his voice rough with sleep but firm. "She pushed him, not the other way around." Sophia turned, her toddler stirring as she nodded. "He was just steadying himself. She's lying." The redhead chimed in, her voice trembling but clear. "I saw it too. He didn't say anything like that." Jamal clenched his fists, his short dreads swaying as he added, "She's covering her ass after stealing my phone." The cabin stirred, a wave of support swelling around Elijah, but Reynolds raised a hand, silencing them with a sharp gesture. "Enough," he barked, his gray eyes cold. "I'll handle this." He turned back to Elijah, his broad hands resting on his hips. "Stand up," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elijah complied, his frail body creaking. As he rose, his cane gripped tight in his left hand. Reynolds nodded to Karen, who stepped forward with a smug glint in her eyes. "Search him," the captain said, his voice flat. Karen's hands moved fast, patting down Elijah's jacket and pants, her fingers brushing the burns with a deliberate roughness that made him wince. She rifled through his pockets, finding nothing but the napkin with Jamal's number and the burner phone, which she glanced at but dismissed as irrelevant. Then, with a sleight of hand too quick to catch, she slipped a folded note into his satchel, her smirk flickering as she pulled it out triumphantly. "What's this?" she asked, unfolding it for Reynolds to see. The scrawled words read, "I'll make you pay," in a handwriting that wasn't Elijah's. Reynolds snatched the note, his frown deepening as he read it. "This yours?" he asked, holding it up. Elijah's sharp eyes widened, a flicker of shock breaking his calm. "No," he said, his gravelly voice firm. "She planted that. I didn't write it." Karen crossed her arms, her voice rising with mock outrage. "He's lying, Captain. He's been trouble since boarding. Reynolds studied the note, then Elijah, his gray eyes narrowing. "Doesn't look good for you," he said, tucking the paper into his pocket. "We'll sort this on the ground. You're under watch until we land. One wrong move and you're in cuffs." He turned to Karen, his voice low. "Keep an eye on him." She nodded, her smirk returning as Reynolds strode back to the cockpit, the door clicking shut behind him. Elijah sank back into his seat, his heart pounding against his frail chest, his burns and bruises a dull roar beneath the fresh weight of this lie. The cabin buzzed with outrage, Tom muttering curses, Sophia whispering to her toddler as her eyes glistened, the redhead staring at Karen with open disgust. Jamal's fists trembled, his voice a hiss. She set him up. Elijah's sharp eyes darkened, his mind racing as he clutched his cane. She'd framed him, turned his resistance into a crime, and now the law loomed over him like a guillotine. His satchel, searched and violated, sat at his feet, the planted note a ticking bomb. He was cornered, his body battered, his allies powerless against her lie. Karen stood at the aisle's end, her posture relaxed, her sharp blue eyes glinting, with victory. She'd escalated, twisted his every move into a threat, and now she held the upper hand. Passengers glared, their whispers a chorus of dissent, but she didn't care. She thought she'd buried him, thought the captain's warning was her shield. Elijah's hand slipped into his pocket, brushing the burner phone, its dark screen a lifeline she couldn't touch. His sharp mind churned, recalculating through the pain. She'd raised the stakes, dragged him into a legal nightmare, but he wasn't done. He'd built Horizon Airlines from dust, fought through worse traps than this, and he'd find a way out. The flight stretched on, the engines a steady drone, but for Elijah, every minute was a countdown to a reckoning she'd never see coming. The Boeing 737 soared through the inky night, its engines a steady roar as it crossed the jagged silhouette of the California border, the sprawling lights of Los Angeles a distant promise below. Inside, the cabin simmered with a restless unease, the dim overhead lights casting a ghostly pallor over the passengers' faces. Elijah Jackson sat slumped in seat 23B, his frail body pressed against the worn gray cushion, his faded brown jacket crusted with blood and coffee stains. His cracked leather satchel lay at his feet, a quiet witness to the planted note that now threatened his freedom. His right arm bore the fading marks of Karen Pierce's grip, his thighs and forearm blistered from her scalding revenge, and a crusted streak of blood marred his temple, a memento of her violent shove. His wooden cane rested against his knee, its scratched surface glinting faintly, a fragile anchor in a storm of lies. His sharp brown eyes, dulled by pain but alive with defiance, stared at the seat back ahead, his mind racing to outpace the legal trap she'd sprung. Across the aisle, Tom Hargrove sat rigid, his crisp white shirt creased, his hazel eyes burning with a quiet fury as he replayed the captain's warning in his head. 2 rows up, Sophia Morales rocked her toddler, the child's soft breaths a fragile calm against her own simmering outrage, her dark ponytail swaying as she glanced back at Elijah. The redhead beside Tom clutched her armrest, her freckles stark against her flushed cheeks, her whispered curses barely audible over the engines. Jamal Carter sat stiffly ahead, his short dreads framing a face taut with anger, his wrist still, tender from Karen's twist, his lost phone a wound that fueled his resolve. The air smelled of stale air and tension, a bitter tang that clung to the cabin like a second skin. Karen Pierce stood near the galley, her navy blazer pristine, her blonde bun a beacon of smug control under the dim lights. Her sharp blue eyes swept the cabin, her crimson lips set in a faint, victorious smirk as she savored her latest triumph. She'd framed Elijah, turned his resistance into a crime, and now the captain's threat hung over him like a noose. She moved with a predator's ease, her polished shoes silent as she checked trays, her confidence unshaken by the passengers' glares. She thought she'd won, thought she'd crushed their little uprising with a single clever lie. But the cabin wasn't as quiet as she believed. A spark flared, a ripple of defiance she couldn't see. Sophia turned fully in her seat, her tired eyes locking onto Tom's. "He's no criminal," she said, her voice low but fierce, cutting through the hum. "She set him up. We all saw it." Tom nodded, his jaw tightening as he leaned forward, his crisp sleeves brushing the armrest. "Damn right," he replied, his tone sharp with conviction. That note was bullshit, and she knows it. The redhead perked up, her voice trembling but clear as she joined in. She shoved him, denied his meal, burned him, and now this. She's the threat here. Jamal twisted around, his short dreads swaying as he added, "Captain's buying her crap because she's got the uniform. We can't let her get away with it." The word spread like wildfire, a hushed rebellion igniting among the rows. A burly man in a Cowboys jersey 3 seats back nodded, his deep voice rumbling. "I saw her plant that note, slick as anything." A teenage girl in a hoodie, her phone clutched tight, whispered to her mother, "He's just an old guy, why's she doing this?" The elderly couple from the jet bridge, their silver hair glinting, leaned toward Sophia, the woman's voice, firm. "We need to do something or she'll ruin him." Her husband grunted, his weathered hands clenching. "She's counting on us staying quiet." Within 10 minutes, the murmur had grown into a plan, a petition born of outrage and scraps, of paper passed hand to hand. Tom pulled a notepad from his briefcase, his pen scratching furious lines as he wrote, "We, the undersigned, demand an investigation into flight attendant Karen Pierce's actions against the passenger in 23B, physical assault, false accusation, and misconduct." Sophia took it next, her toddler stirring as she scrawled her name, her handwriting shaky but bold. Jamal signed with a flourish, his anger bleeding into the ink, while the redhead added hers, her freckles flushed with resolve. The burly man, the teenage girl, the elderly couple, they all joined. 50 signatures in 10 minutes, a chorus of dissent that stretched across the cabin. The petition reached Elijah, his sharp eyes scanning the words, a flicker of hope piercing the fog of pain. He signed last, his gnarled fingers steady as he wrote Elijah Jackson, the weight of his name a secret only he knew. Sophia stood, her toddler cradled in one arm, the petition clutched in the other as she marched toward the galley, her dark ponytail bouncing with every step. Tom followed, his crisp shirt a flag of solidarity, his voice loud enough to draw the captain's ear. "Captain Reynolds, you need to see this," he called, his tone cutting through the cabin's hum. Karen's head snapped up, her smirk faltering as she saw the crowd gathering, the paper waving like a banner. Reynolds emerged. From the cockpit, his salt and pepper beard bristling, his gray eyes narrowing as he took the petition from Sophia's trembling hand. He read it, his frown deepening with every line, the weight of 50 names pressing against Karen's lie. Karen stepped forward, her sharp blue eyes flashing with defiance. "That's nonsense," she snapped, her southern drawl thick with scorn. "He's a troublemaker and they're just stirred up." But Reynolds raised a hand, his voice a low growl. 50 people don't lie for fun," he said, his gaze shifting to Elijah, who sat still, his blood-crusted temple a silent. "Accusation. Misunderstanding, sir," he added, his tone softer now, an apology forced by the crowd's will. "We'll look into it on the ground." He turned back to the cockpit, the petition tucked under his arm, leaving Karen fuming, her plan backfiring in a blaze of passenger fury. Elijah breathed easier, his chest loosening as the cabin buzzed with triumph. Tom clapped his shoulder, Sophia smiled faintly, and the redhead whispered, "We got her." For a moment he let himself believe it, the tide turning, the noose loosening around his neck. His sharp eyes glinted, a spark of hope rekindled as he leaned back, his burns and bruises a dull ache he could ignore. But Karen wasn't done. She slipped into the galley, her smirk replaced by a snarl as she grabbed a teapot, her fingers trembling with rage. She poured a cup, her sharp eyes glinting with a new plan, and stirred in a sedative from a hidden vial, her movements quick and discreet. She strode back to Elijah's row, her voice a sickly sweet mask. "Tea, sir? To calm your nerves?" Elijah nodded, his sharp gaze wary but unsuspecting as he took the cup, its warmth a fleeting comfort against his pain. "Thank you," he said, his gravelly voice steady as he sipped, the bitter liquid sliding down his throat. Karen lingered, her crimson lips curling faintly as she whispered, "You'll sleep through your little victory." She turned away, her stride light, her satisfaction a quiet venom. Minutes later, Elijah's head lolled, his sharp eyes fluttering shut as the sedative hit, his frail body slumping against the seat. The cabin dimmed in his vision, his cane slipping to the floor, with a soft thud as darkness swallowed him whole. Karen smirked from the galley, her counterattack a silent dagger, her triumph snatched back from their fleeting rally. Hey folks, what do you make of this twist? Comment with a 1 if you're cheering for the passengers' stand against Karen's lies, or a 2 if you think Elijah's trust in them just cost him big. Was Sophia's courage the spark they needed, or did it push Karen too far? Drop your thoughts below. Hit that like button if you're hooked on this fight for justice, and smash subscribe to catch every wild turn. Did you see that? Sedative coming, or is Karen's ruthlessness still shocking you? Now here's the real question. Can Elijah wake up from this trap, or has Karen finally stacked the odds too high against him? The Boeing 737 sliced through the night, its engines a steady hum as it neared the glittering sprawl of Los Angeles, the city's lights a faint shimmer on the horizon. Inside, the cabin buzzed with a fragile hope, the passengers' mid-flight rally still echoing in their hushed whispers. Elijah Jackson slumped in seat 23B, his frail body limp against the worn gray cushion, his faded brown jacket crusted with blood and coffee stains. His cracked leather satchel lay at his feet, untouched, while his wooden cane rested on the floor, its scratched surface glinting faintly in the dim light. His right arm bore the fading marks of Karen Pierce's grip. His thighs and forearm blistered from her scalding coffee, and a crusted streak of blood marred his temple from her violent shove. His sharp brown eyes, once fierce with resolve, were closed now, his head lolling to one side as the sedative Karen had slipped into his tea, dragged him into a deep, unnatural sleep. His breathing slowed, shallow and uneven, a faint wheeze escaping, his lips with every rise of his chest. Across the aisle, Tom Hargrove leaned forward, his crisp white shirt creased, his hazel eyes narrowing as he glanced at Elijah, sensing something off. 2 rows up, Sophia Morales rocked her toddler, her dark ponytail swaying as she turned to check on the old man, her tired face tightening with unease. The redhead beside Tom fidgeted, her freckles stark against her pale skin, her fingers twisting, the empty granola wrapper as she whispered, "He's too quiet." Jamal Carter sat rigid ahead, his short dreads framing a face etched with worry, his wrist still sore from Karen's twist, his lost phone a bitter memory. The air carried a faint antiseptic tang, mingling with the stale scent of recycled air, a quiet tension threading through the cabin as the flight stretched on. Karen Pierce stood near the galley, her navy blazer pristine, her blonde bun a beacon of cold control under the dim lights. Her sharp blue eyes glinted with a smug satisfaction, her crimson lips set in a faint, triumphant curve as she watched. Elijah slumped deeper into his seat. She'd spiked his tea, turned their fleeting victory into a silent defeat. And now she savored the stillness, her counterattack a masterstroke she thought no one would catch. She moved with a casual grace, her polished shoes silent as she adjusted a tray, her confidence a shield against the passenger's fading defiance. She believed she'd won, believed she'd buried him for good this time. But Sophia noticed first. She shifted her toddler to one arm, her sharp eyes catching the unnatural pallor creeping across Elijah's dark skin, the way his chest barely rose with each breath. Her heart lurched, a cold dread pooling in her gut as she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her voice piercing the cabin's hum. "He's dying," she shouted, her tone raw with panic as she stumbled toward him, her dark ponytail whipping behind her. Tom jolted upright, his hazel eyes wide as he followed her gaze, his crisp shirt rustling as he leapt from his seat. "What the hell?" he muttered, rushing to Elijah's side, his hands hovering over the old man's slumped form. The redhead gasped, her wrapper falling to the floor as she fumbled for her call button, her voice trembling. "Someone get help." Jamal turned, his short dreads swaying as he stood, his fists clenched. "She did something to him," he growled, his eyes locking onto Karen with a fury that could burn through steel. The cabin erupted, passengers craning their necks, their whispers swelling into a chaotic roar. The burly man in the Cowboys jersey stood, his deep voice booming. "He's not breathing right." The teenage girl in the hoodie pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she started recording. her mother clutching her arm in panic. The elderly couple from the jet bridge exchanged a grim look, the woman's silver hair glinting as she said, "We need medics now." Karen froze near the galley, her smirk faltering as the chaos spun out of her control, her sharp blue eyes darting to Elijah's still form. She stepped forward, her voice a forced calm. "He must have overreacted," she said, her southerny drawl thin with feigned concern. "Probably just tired." But her words drowned in the uproar, the passengers' glares piercing through her lie. Tom pressed 2 fingers to Elijah's neck, his brow creasing as he felt the pulse, faint and sluggish beneath his touch. "He's barely there," he said, his voice tight with urgency as he looked up at Sophia. "Get the crew." Sophia nodded, sprinting toward the galley, her toddler jostling in her arms as she shouted, "Emergency! He's dying!" The redhead hit her call button again, her freckles flushed with panic, while Jamal stormed toward Karen, his voice a low snarl. "What did you do to him?" Karen raised her hands, her smirk replaced by a flicker of unease as she backed away. "I didn't do anything," she snapped, her tone sharp but shaky. "He's old, probably sick." The intercom crackled, Captain Reynolds's voice cutting through the chaos, calm, but edged with steel. "Flight attendants, report to 23B now. We're diverting to Phoenix for an emergency landing." The plane tilted slightly, its engines roaring louder as it banked toward the desert city, the cabin shuddering with the sudden shift. Karen's face paled, her sharp blue eyes widening as she realized the stakes had jumped beyond her control. She moved toward Elijah, her polished shoes clicking fast, but Tom blocked her path, his crisp shirt a wall between her and the old man. "Stay back," he warned, his hazel eyes blazing. "You've done enough." 2 medics from the crew rushed down the aisle, a young woman with a buzz cut and a wiry man with a first aid kit, their navy vests marked with Horizon Airlines logos. They knelt beside Elijah, the woman checking his pulse as the man pulled an oxygen mask from the kit, its plastic crinkling as he fitted it over Elijah's slack face. "Pulse is weak, respiration's dropping," the woman said, her voice clipped, as she pressed a stethoscope to his chest. The man injected a stimulant, his hands steady as he worked, the needle glinting under the dim lights. Passengers watched, breathless, their eyes locked on the frail figure in 23B. Sophia stood, nearby, her toddler clinging to her leg, her dark ponytail still as she whispered, "Come on, hang in there." Minutes stretched into eternity, the plane descending fast, its engines a deafening roar as it aimed for Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. The medics worked in tandem, the woman pumping oxygen, the man monitoring vitals, their voices, a low hum of urgency. Elijah's chest twitched, a faint shudder as the stimulant kicked in, his sharp brown eyes fluttering open, glassy but alive. He coughed, a weak, rasping sound muffled by the mask, his gnarled fingers twitching against the armrest. "He's back," the woman said, relief flooding her tone as she adjusted the oxygen flow. Tom exhaled, his crisp shirt sagging as he sank back while Sophia's eyes glistened, her toddler burying his face in her skirt. Elijah's vision swam, the cabin a blur of gray and light, his sharp mind clawing through the fog. Pain pulsed through his burns and bruises, his head throbbing, but he was alive, barely. He turned his head, his gaze locking onto Sophia, his gravelly voice a whisper through the mask. "She did this." Sophia nodded, her face hardening as she glanced at Karen, who stood frozen near the galley, her sharp blue eyes darting with a panic she couldn't hide. The passengers glared, their outrage a tangible force, their whispers a chorus of accusation. Tom muttered, "She's done for," while the redhead hissed, "Monster." Jamal's fists trembled, his voice a low growl. "We've got her now." The plane touched down in Phoenix with a jolt, the wheels screeching against the runway. As it taxied to a halt, medics prepped a stretcher, their movement swift as they lifted Elijah, his frail body limp but breathing, his sharp eyes glinting with a resolve that refused to break. Karen watched, her smirk gone, her pale face tight with a fear she couldn't mask. She'd nearly killed him and they knew it. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed her union rep, her voice a hushed plea. "I need backup now," she muttered, her sharp blue eyes flickering as she plotted her next move. She wasn't done. Not yet. She'd fight to the end, refusing to let him win. Elijah's stretcher rolled toward the jet bridge, his sharp mind already turning, his whispered words to Sophia a spark in the dark. Karen thought she'd buried him, thought she'd escaped the storm. She was wrong, and he'd make sure she paid with everything she had. The Boeing 737 sat still on the tarmac at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, its engines silent, the cabin a hollow shell as the jet bridge locked into place with a metallic thud. The night air outside was dry and sharp, a faint whiff of jet fuel seeping through the open door. Elijah Jackson lay on a stretcher, his frail body strapped tight, his faded brown jacket crusted with blood and coffee stains. His cracked leather satchel rested beside him, its worn surface glinting under the harsh lights of the jet bridge. His right arm bore the fading marks of Karen Pierce's grip, his thighs and forearm blistered from her scalding coffee, and a crusted streak of blood traced his temple from her violent shove. The oxygen mask clung to his face, its plastic fogging with each shallow breath, his sharp brown eyes half open, glassy but alive with a fire that refused to fade. The medics wheeled him forward, their navy vests marked with Horizon Airlines, logos, their footsteps quick against the rubber floor as they navigated the tunnel toward the terminal. Inside the plane, the cabin buzzed with a raw electric outrage, passengers lingering in their seats, their voices a low roar of disbelief and anger. Tom Hargrove stood near the aisle, his crisp white shirt untucked, his hazel eyes burning as he watched Elijah's stretcher disappear. Sophia Morales clutched her toddler close, her dark ponytail swaying as she gathered her scuffed black carry-on, her tired face set with determination. The redhead beside Tom gripped her armrest, her freckles stark against her flushed cheeks, her whispered curses a steady stream. Jamal Carter paced near his seat, his short dreads swaying, his fists clenched as he muttered, "She's not getting away with this." The air carried a stale mix of sweat and antiseptic, a bitter reminder of the flight's descent into chaos. Karen Pierce stood near the galley, her navy blazer still pristine, her blonde bun unmoved by the storm she'd unleashed. Her sharp, blue eyes darted toward the jet bridge, her crimson lips pressed into a thin line as she clutched her phone, her union rep's voice a faint buzz in her ear. She'd nearly killed Elijah, and the passengers knew it, their glares a wall of judgment she couldn't escape. Her pale face tightened, her confidence cracking as she whispered, "Send someone now." Her southern drawl edged with panic. She hung up, her fingers trembling as she smoothed her blazer, her mind racing to salvage her unraveling control. She thought she could still win, thought her next move would bury him for good. The jet bridge stretched ahead, its scuffed walls closing in as the medics pushed Elijah toward the terminal. Passengers followed, their footsteps a chaotic shuffle, their voices rising into a chorus of outrage. Tom carried Sophia's carry-on, his crisp shirt a beacon of solidarity, while Jamal filmed with a borrowed phone, his lens catching every detail. The redhead trailed behind, her freckles flushed as she muttered, "This is insane." But as Elijah's stretcher neared the terminal door, a new sound cut through the clamor, a low, menacing growl that stopped the medics cold. Outside, a squad of 6 men waited, their silhouettes dark against the terminal's fluorescent glow. Leading them was Dale Pierce, Karen's brother, a hulking cop in his late 30s with a buzzed head and a sneer twisting his sunburned face. His police uniform strained against his broad chest, his badge glinting as he stepped forward, his boots thudding against the floor. "He assaulted my sister," Karen shouted from the jet bridge, her voice piercing the chaos as she pointed at Elijah, her sharp blue eyes wild with desperation. "Arrest him!" Dale didn't hesitate, his meaty hand slamming the stretcher to a halt, his squad fanning out to block the medics. "You heard her," he barked, his voice a gravelly snarl, as he yanked the oxygen mask from Elijah's face, tossing it aside with a clatter. "You're under arrest, old man." He grabbed Elijah's frail arm, wrenching it behind his back, the burns flaring as the old man grunted in pain. The medics protested, the woman with the buzz cut shouting, "He's critical. Let him go." But Dale shoved her back, his sneer widening. "Back off, or you're next." Passengers flooded the terminal, their outrage exploding into shouts as they saw Elijah cuffed, his frail body dragged from the stretcher. Tom dropped Sophia's bag, his hazel eyes blazing as he yelled, "He's half dead, you bastard!" Sophia clutched her toddler, her voice cracking as she screamed, "She poisoned him, not the other way around." Jamal kept filming, his borrowed phone steady as he narrated, "Phoenix PD framing an innocent man. Right here." The redhead fumbled for her phone, her freckles flushed as she started recording too, her voice trembling. "This is wrong." The burly man in the Cowboys jersey pushed forward, his deep voice booming, "Let him go!" While the teenage girl and her mother joined the chorus, their phones aloft. Dale's squad moved fast, snatching phones from hands, their boots stomping. As they barked, "No filming!" Jamal ducked a grab, his short dreads swaying as he shouted, "You can't stop us!" But two cops tackled him, wrestling the phone away as he hit the floor hard. The redhead's device clattered across the tiles, smashed under a boot. Her cry of protest lost in the chaos. The elderly couple stood back, the woman's silver hair glinting as she clutched her husband, her voice firm. "This is a disgrace." Dale dragged Elijah toward a holding cell in the terminal, his frail body limp against the cop's grip, his sharp brown eyes flickering with pain but never breaking. Blood trickled anew from his temple, his burns screaming as the cuffs bit into his wrists. The cell door slammed shut, a cold clang echoing through the terminal as Dale locked Elijah inside, his sneer a twisted mask of triumph. The room was a stark box, its concrete walls scratched and gray, a single metal bench bolted to the floor. Elijah slumped against it, his breath shallow, his frail body trembling with exhaustion and pain. His jacket hung loose, his satchel confiscated, by Dale's squad, its secrets out of reach. Bruises bloomed on his arms, his sharp eyes clouded but alive, his mind racing despite the fog. He was trapped, battered, alone. The passengers' cries muffled beyond the thick door. He thought it was over, thought she'd finally won. Her brother's brute force the final blow. But then, a new sound pierced the haze, a sharp click of heels against tile, a voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Grace Thompson burst into the terminal, a fierce black woman in her 40s, her tailored suit a deep crimson, her short curls framing a face set with unyielding resolve. Her brown eyes blazed as she strode toward the cell, a thick folder under her arm, her heels a staccato beat of authority. She was Elijah's lawyer, a titan who'd fought beside him for decades, her presence a storm breaking over the scene. "Release him," she commanded, her voice a low, steely roar as she faced Dale, her folder slamming onto a nearby table. "You've got no grounds, and I've got proof." Dale sneered, his sunburned face twisting as he stepped forward. "He assaulted an officer's sister," he growled, his hand on his baton. Grace didn't flinch, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "Your sister's a liar," she said, flipping open the folder to reveal Horizon Airlines ownership papers, Elijah's name bold across the top. "He owns this airline and she's the one who'll pay." The passengers gasped, their voices swelling as Jamal scrambled up, his borrowed phone retrieved, filming again. Tom's jaw dropped, Sophia's toddler whimpered, and the redhead stared, her freckles pale with shock. Karen's face drained of color, her sharp blue eyes wide as she stumbled from the jet bridge, her smirk shattered. Dale hesitated, his sneer faltering as Grace's words sank in, the papers a guillotine over his head. Elijah sat still in the cell, his sharp eyes glinting through the bars, a faint smile tugging at his lips. She'd escalated, unleashed her brother's mob, but Grace was here and the tide was turning. Karen's smugness cracked, her panic a raw wound as she realized the trap she'd walked into. The terminal at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport buzzed with a chaotic fury, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare over the concrete floors and glass walls. Elijah Jackson sat slumped in the holding cell, his frail body pressed against the cold metal bench, his faded brown jacket stiff with blood and coffee stains. His right arm throbbed with the fading marks of Karen Pierce's grip, his thighs and forearm blistered from her scalding coffee, and a crusted streak of blood traced his temple from her violent shove. His sharp brown eyes, clouded with exhaustion, but glinting with resolve, stared through the bars, his breath shallow but steady. His cracked leather satchel had been confiscated, its secrets locked away by Dale's squad, and his wooden cane lay abandoned on the jet bridge, a relic of a fight he refused to lose. Outside the cell, Grace Thompson stood like a storm in her crimson suit, her short curls framing a face carved with unyielding determination. Her brown eyes blazed as she faced Dale Pierce, Karen's hulking cop brother, his sunburned sneer faltering under her glare. The ownership papers for Horizon Airlines lay spread across a table, Elijah's name in bold print, a silent thunderclap that shook the terminal. Passengers crowded the scene, their voices a rising tide of outrage and awe. Tom Hargrove stood with his crisp white shirt untucked, his hazel eyes wide as he processed the revelation. Sophia Morales clutched her toddler, her dark ponytail still, her tired face alight with hope. Jamal Carter filmed with a borrowed phone, his short dreads swaying as he captured every word, while the redhead's freckles flushed with shock, her phone aloft beside him. Karen Pierce stumbled from the jet bridge, her navy blazer pristine but her sharp blue eyes wild with panic, her blonde bun a stark contrast to her paling face. Her crimson lips parted, her breath hitching as Grace's voice cut through the chaos. "Elijah Jackson owns Horizon Airlines," Grace declared, her tone a steel blade as she slapped the papers against the table. "Your sister assaulted him, framed him, and nearly killed him. She's finished." Dale's squad froze, their boots scuffing the floor as the weight of her words sank in. The terminal erupted, passengers shouting, "She's done!" And justice, as Jamal's lens zoomed in, his voice a steady narration. "Owner brutalized by his own employee, caught on tape." Grace turned to Dale, her heels clicking as she closed the distance, her folder a weapon in her hand. "Unlock that cell," she commanded, her brown eyes unblinking. "You've got no case, and I've got witnesses." Dale's sneer twisted, his meaty hand hovering over his baton, but a sharp voice cut through the din. "Do it," barked a new figure, a Horizon Airlines board member in a sleek gray suit, his bald head gleaming as he stormed in with two others, their briefcases swinging. "We've seen enough," he added, his tone clipped as he nodded to Grace. Dale's jaw tightened, his sunburned face flushing as he fumbled with the keys, the cell door swinging open with a reluctant creak. Elijah rose slowly, his frail body trembling but unbroken, his sharp eyes locking onto Karen as he stepped out, his bruises a map of her cruelty. Grace took his arm, her grip firm but gentle, her voice low. "It's over for her." The board member, a wiry man named Harold Vance, faced Karen, his gray eyes cold. "Karen Pierce, you're fired. Effective immediately," he said, his words a guillotine drop. "Your actions are a disgrace to this company." Karen's sharp blue eyes widened, her crimson lips parting in a scream. "He's lying," she shouted, her southern drawl cracking as she lunged toward Elijah, her hands clawing the air. "He's nobody. I didn't do anything." Dale grabbed her shoulder, his sneer gone, his voice a growl. "Shut up, Karen." The terminals, chaos swelled, passengers cheering as Elijah stood tall, his sharp eyes glinting with a quiet triumph. Tom clapped Sophia's shoulder, her toddler blinking awake as she smiled, while the redhead whispered, "Unbelievable." Jamal lowered his phone, his short dreads still as he muttered, "Gotcha." But Karen wasn't finished. She broke free from Dale's grip, her sharp blue eyes blazing with a desperate fury as she pulled her own phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "You won't win," she hissed, uploading a doctored video to a fringe social media site, her voice a venomous whisper. "He harassed me, threatened me. You'll see." The clip, edited with shaky cuts and dubbed audio, showed Elijah looming over her, his frail form twisted into a menace, her own cries amplified to sound pitiful. Within minutes, the video spread, pinging across phones in the terminal, a distorted lie that lit a match in the dry tinder of hate. A white supremacist mob, already lurking near the airport after a rally, seized the bait, their shouts echoing as they stormed the tarmac. 50 men in faded caps and patched jackets surged toward the plane, their fists clutching pipes and chains, their slurs a guttural roar that drowned the passengers' cheers. "Get the bastard!" one yelled, his voice a snarl as he smashed a window on the 737, glass shattering across the runway. Another swung a chain at the fuselage, metal screeching as it dented, while a third torched a fuel cart, flames licking the night sky. The terminal shook, security scrambling as the mob trashed Elijah's plane, their chants a vile chorus against his name. Elijah stumbled back, Grace pulling him toward a side exit, her crimson suit a beacon as she shouted, "Move!" Tom grabbed Sophia's toddler, his crisp shirt tearing as he shielded them, while Jamal filmed the chaos, his lens catching the fire's glow. The redhead ducked behind a counter, her freckles pale as she gasped, "They're insane!" Dale's squad hesitated, their boots rooted as the mob overwhelmed them, their batons useless against the tide. Karen stood frozen, her sharp blue eyes glinting with a twisted glee as the flames rose, her smirk returning. She'd lost her job, her power, but she'd struck back, her final blow a savage chaos that nearly destroyed Elijah's empire. His plane burned, its Horizon Airlines logo melting in the heat, his legacy teetering as the mob roared. Grace shoved Elijah into a security van, her heels skidding as she slammed the door, her voice a fierce whisper, "We're getting you out." The van peeled away, tires squealing as it raced from the tarmac, the fire's glow fading in the rear view. Elijah's sharp eyes stared ahead, his frail body trembling, his breath ragged as he clutched his bruised arm. His plane was trashed, his reputation teetering under her lie, and the passengers scattered in the chaos. He'd escaped, narrowly, but the damage was done, a wound deeper than his burns and bruises. Karen grinned from the terminal, her sharp blue eyes alight with a mad triumph, thinking she'd won the war, her last stand a blaze of destruction. Inside the van, Elijah's sharp mind churned, his sharp eyes narrowing as he pieced it together. She'd escalated, turned her defeat into a mob's vengeance, but he wasn't broken. His legacy hung by a thread, his airline's name smeared in fire and hate. But he'd faced worse, built it from nothing through storms like this. Grace gripped his hand, her brown eyes fierce. "We'll fight this," she said, her voice a vow. Elijah nodded, his gravelly voice a whisper. "She thinks it's over." The van sped toward a safe house, the city blurring past. But for Elijah, every mile was a step toward a reckoning she couldn't fathom. Karen's last stand had burned bright, but his fire was still alive and he'd make it consume her. The security van rumbled through the dark streets of Phoenix, its tires humming against the asphalt as it sped away from the chaos of Sky Harbor International Airport. Inside, Elijah Jackson sat slumped against the vinyl seat, his frail body trembling, his faded brown jacket stiff with blood and coffee stains. His right arm ached with the fading marks of Karen Pierce's grip, his thighs and forearm blistered from her scalding coffee, and a crusted streak of blood traced his temple from her violent shove. His sharp brown eyes, clouded with exhaustion, but blazing with a fierce resolve, stared into the shadows ahead, his breath ragged but steady. His cracked leather satchel rested beside him, retrieved by Grace from Dale's squad, its worn surface a quiet testament to a legacy under siege. The wooden cane he'd relied on was gone, lost in the mob's rampage, but his spirit stood taller than ever. Grace Thompson sat beside him, her crimson suit a stark splash of color in the dim van, her short curls framing a face set with unyielding determination. Her brown eyes glinted with a fire that matched his, her hand gripping his as the van raced toward a safe house on the city's edge. The driver, a burly security guard with a shaved head, kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white against the wheel as he navigated the quiet streets. Outside, the night was a blur of neon signs and empty sidewalks, the distant wail of sirens fading as the airport's chaos receded. Elijah's sharp mind churned, piecing together the mob's attack, Karen's doctored video, the fire consuming his plane. His legacy teetered, his airline's name smeared in hate, but he'd faced worse storms, built Horizon from dust through battles like this. "She thinks she's won," he whispered, his gravelly voice a thread of steel. Grace squeezed his hand, her voice low. "She's wrong." The safe house loomed ahead, a squat brick building tucked behind a row of scraggly palms, its windows dark and unassuming. The van pulled into a gravel driveway, crunching to a stop as Grace helped Elijah out, his frail body leaning on her strength. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood, a single lamp casting a warm glow over a sparse living room. A laptop sat on a rickety table, its screen flickering to life as Grace sat Elijah down, her heels clicking against the hardwood. She pulled a USB drive from her suit pocket, its sleek black case glinting as she plugged it in, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You planned this," she said, her tone a mix of awe and certainty. Elijah nodded, his sharp brown eyes glinting as he adjusted his bruised arm. "Every flight's recorded," he replied, his voice steady. "I tested my airline, and she failed." Grace opened a file, unedited footage from the plane's security cameras flooding the screen, a mosaic of angles capturing every moment. Karen dragging him down the jet bridge, her sneer vivid as his cane clattered, her denying his meal, smirking as she snatched Tom's tray. The coffee spill, her mock apology as his skin blistered, the turbulent shove, his head cracking the window as blood trickled. The sedative slipped into his tea, her faint smirk as he slumped. The footage was raw, undeniable, a truth Karen couldn't twist. Elijah's sharp eyes watched, his frail body still but his spirit a furnace of resolve. "Broadcast it," he said, his gravelly voice a command. Grace nodded, her fingers flying across the keys as she linked the laptop to a live stream, her voice a low hum. "This ends now." Minutes later, Elijah's face filled screens worldwide, the safe house's dim light casting shadows across his blood-crusted temple, his blistered hands resting on the table. "I'm Elijah Jackson," he began, his gravelly voice cutting through the digital ether, steady despite his frailty. "Owner of Horizon Airlines. I've endured racism on my own flight to test my company, and what you're about to see is the result." The footage rolled, each clip a hammer blow, Karen's every act exposed in stark clarity. Passengers gasped. In homes and bars, their phones buzzing as the stream spread, a tidal wave of truth washing over the lies. The jet bridge assault played, her snarl echoing as his cane fell. The meal denial flashed, her smirk a dagger as he sat hungry. The coffee burned again, his wince a silent cry as she gloated. The turbulence shoved stunned, his blood a stark smear as she accused him. The sedative sealed it, her quiet triumph a death knell as he faded. Phoenix erupted, the mob's chants faltering as their phones lit up, the doctored video debunked by the unedited flood. Cops swarmed the airport, their sirens a piercing wail as they arrested the rioters, their pipes and chains clattering to the tarmac. The fire on Elijah's plane sputtered out, firefighters dousing the wreckage as security hauled the last of the mob away, their slurs silenced by cuffs. Karen Pierce stood frozen in the terminal, her navy blazer askew, her blonde bun fraying, as her sharp blue eyes stared at a screen, the footage looping her downfall. Her crimson lips parted, a silent scream as cops approached, their boots thudding against the tile. "Karen Pierce," one said, his voice a flat decree. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, assault, and falsifying evidence." Her hands shook as cuffs snapped around her wrists, her sharp eyes darting in panic, her smirk gone, her world collapsing in a single, shattering moment. Elijah watched from the safe house, his sharp brown eyes glinting with a quiet triumph as the stream's numbers soared, millions witnessing her end. Grace stood beside him, her crimson suit a pillar of strength, her voice soft. "It's done." He nodded, his frail body easing as he leaned back, the pain in his burns and bruises, a dull echo now. His legacy stood, battered but unbroken, the mob's fire a scar he'd heal. But he wasn't finished. He turned to Grace, his gravelly voice firm. "Take it," he said, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Horizon's yours now. Root out the rot." Grace's brown eyes widened, her breath catching as she processed his words. She nodded, her short curls bouncing as she gripped his hand, her resolve a mirror to his own. "I'll make it right," she vowed, her voice a steel promise. The stream ended, Elijah's face fading from screens as the world buzzed with his story, a reckoning that reshaped Horizon Airlines overnight. Karen's arrest flashed across news feeds, her mugshot a stark contrast to her once pristine uniform, her sharp blue eyes hollow with defeat. Her career was ash, her freedom gone, her last stand a blaze that consumed her instead. Dale Pierce slumped in the terminal, his badge stripped as internal affairs swarmed, his sunburned face pale with the weight of his own ruin. The passengers scattered, Tom and Sophia safe with her toddler, Jamal's footage a viral echo, the redhead's shock a quiet memory. They'd fought, witnessed, and won, their rally a spark that Elijah had fanned into a fire. In the safe house, Elijah stood, his frail body steady despite the pain, his sharp brown eyes glinting as he looked out the window, the city a blur of lights beyond the palms. He'd retired, handed Horizon to Grace, a woman who'd fight as he had, who'd purge the prejudice he'd exposed. The twist burned bright. He'd planned this all along, a test turned triumph, his humiliation a weapon that broke Karen's world. His legacy shifted, not in flames but in reform, a company reborn under Grace's fierce hand. The night stretched on, the sirens fading, but for Elijah, it was dawn. A new day forged in the ashes of a fight he'd never lost. Elijah Jackson's harrowing journey aboard Horizon Airlines reveals profound truths about resilience, justice, and the insidious nature of prejudice. The first lesson is the power of endurance. Elijah, a frail 72-year-old black man, faced relentless racial injustice, physical assault, humiliation, and near death, yet never broke. His story teaches us that strength isn't loud, it's the quiet resolve to keep fighting when the odds stack high. Second, it exposes how systemic bias festers unchecked. Karen Pierce's actions, from dragging Elijah down the jet bridge to poisoning his tea, weren't isolated. They thrived in a culture that ignored her cruelty until it exploded. This reminds us to question authority and hold it accountable, no matter the uniform. Third, unity can shift tides. Passengers like Sophia, Tom, and Jamal rallied for Elijah, their collective defiance forcing a crack in Karen's lies. It's a call to stand up, not stand by, when wrong unfolds before us. The final lesson is justice's triumph through truth. Elijah's unedited footage flipped Karen's narrative, proving that facts can dismantle even the most vicious deception. His decision to test his airline and expose its flaws wasn't revenge. It was accountability, a gift to a legacy he handed to Grace. We learn that real power isn't in retaliation but in building something better from the ashes. Karen's downfall, her career and freedom lost, shows that prejudice doesn't just harm its targets, it consumes its wielders too. So, what's your takeaway? How would you fight back against injustice in Elijah's shoes? Drop a comment below. With your thoughts, hit like if this story stirred you, and subscribe for more tales of grit and justice. Share this with someone who needs to see it. Let's spread the fight against bias together. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride. And here's to a future where fairness soars higher than hate ever could.